On a cold day in 1976, a salvage crew was taking apart a French chateau on the shore of Lake St. Clair, just outside Detroit. It had 75 rooms. It had once been the most expensive house ever built in the city. Now men with crowbars were pulling the lead off the roof and stacking the cut stone in the yard, selling the place down to its fixtures, piece by piece. I have gone back to that demolition more often than I can explain. The house was called Rose Terrace. It had been built by a woman who was, for a stretch of the 20th century, one of the richest in the world. She had filled it with 18th century French furniture chosen for her by the most famous art dealer alive. She died in it. And 6 years later, nobody on earth would take the house, not as a purchase and not as a gift, because the cost of simply keeping it standing would have ruined them. Consider a few things before we go any further. Two brothers built a car company from a machine shop and then died within 11 months of each other. In the same year, their two widows sold that company for $146 million, paid in a single certified check, the largest cash transfer of an industrial concern in American history to that point. A 21-year-old heir drowned on his honeymoon 13 days after his wedding, following a dynamite explosion at the lodge where the party was staying. A son of the family, married 5 times, died $10.5 million in debt to his own mother. A daughter-in-law sued her 93-year-old mother-in-law and won millions. Then a few years later, pleaded guilty to stealing more than $400,000 from her own son. And today there is no Dodge Foundation, no Dodge Trust, no Dodge wing of any museum, while the Ford family and the Kresge family endure through exactly the kind of structures the Dodges never built. Every one of those things is in the public record. They are also not the strangest part of the story. This is the story of 2 Detroit machinists who turned $10,000 into one of the greatest car fortunes in America. It is also the story of how that fortune disappeared within 2 generations, not because one thief took it, but because nothing was ever built to hold it. I want to start at the house, because the house is where most of the answers are, and because the way it ended tells you almost everything about the way the money was kept. Before we go on, one quick thing. If you subscribe, it helps build a community around these and rewards the work that goes into them. And it is free. Chapter 1. The house on the Lake Rose Terrace stood on Lakeshore Road in Grosse Pointe Farms, on a stretch of waterfront where Detroit's automobile money had built itself a row of palaces. It was a Louis XV chateau in the French manner, designed by the architect Horace Trumbauer, finished in the mid-1930s. By the counts that survive, it ran to about 42,000 square feet, with around 75 rooms, set on close to 9 acres that terraced down to the water. By most accounts, it was the costliest house ever built in metropolitan Detroit. Trumbauer modeled it on a mansion he had designed in Newport, an enlarged version of a house called Miramar, scaled up for a client who could afford the scale. There had already been a fine house on that land, a red sandstone mansion by the architect Albert Kahn that Anna and Horace had built in 1912. Anna tore it down. She bought the country club next door as well, and took in its grounds, so that the new chateau could sit on close to 9 acres, running clean to the lake. The woman who built it was named Anna Dodge. She had raised an earlier mansion on the same site, a perfectly good one, to put it up. She had bought the country club next door and taken its land too. And the reason she could do all of this, the reason a piano teacher born in Scotland ended her life in a French chateau on a Michigan lake, was that her husband and his brother had built a car company and other people had paid an enormous amount of money for it. Inside, she kept one of the finest private collections of 18th century French furniture in America, assembled on buying tours of Europe, guided by the dealer Joseph Duveen, the man who sold Old World art to New World money. Somewhere in the house was a 5-strand pearl necklace that had once belonged to Catherine the Great of Russia, bought for her by Horace from Cartier. The house was not a home so much as a vault with rooms. When Anna died in 1970, the house passed into a strange kind of limbo. It was beautiful. It was historic. It was placed on the National Register. None of that mattered. The thing that mattered was the arithmetic of keeping it. The upkeep alone ran to something like $125,000 a year, and that was the floor, not the ceiling. No private buyer wanted it. No institution wanted it. A house that had cost a fortune to build was now worth less than nothing, because to own it was to pay, every year, simply for the privilege of keeping a thing that nobody needed and nobody could use. I find that detail hard to get past. Here was the most expensive house ever built in a great American city, and within a few years of its owner's death, it had become a liability that no amount of history could offset. So they took it apart. The contents had already been sold at auction. Then the house itself was dismantled, and the salvage was sold off, and the land was subdivided into what the developers called executive homes. The contents had gone first, sold off at auction the year after she died. Then the house itself was taken apart. The entire paneled music room, with its furnishings, went to the Detroit Institute of Arts, reportedly with a gift of about $1 million attached. The leftover fittings, the doors and the mantels and the carved stone, reportedly brought another $650,000. One person involved in the stripping of the place described it almost as a fire sale. The driveway and the trees and the very roof sold off, until there was nothing left to sell. There is a way of looking at that house that explains the whole family. The fortune did not vanish into thin air. For a long stretch it was extremely visible, in stone and lead and French furniture. In a chateau you could see from the lake. The trouble was that almost all of it had been turned into things, beautiful things that cost money to keep and returned nothing, rather than into anything that might generate or protect more money. A house is not an endowment. It does not compound. It only decays and asks to be paid for, until one day the asking is louder than the love, and the crew arrives with crowbars. That is where this story ends, with a crew selling a chateau for parts. To understand how it got there, you have to go back about 100 years and a few hundred miles, to a machine shop in Detroit, and two brothers nobody in polite society would have invited to dinner. Chapter 2. The Machine Shop. John Francis Dodge was born in 1864, and his younger brother Horace Elgin Dodge in 1868, in Niles, Michigan, the sons of a machinist named Daniel Rugg Dodge. Their father was a machinist, and the boys grew up around lathes and castings and the smell of cut metal. There was no money to speak of. What there was instead was a trade, passed from a father's hands into his son's, and an early and total fluency in how metal could be made to do what you wanted. John was the older one, the one with the head for business and the temper to match. Horace was the mechanic, the one with the genuine gift, the brother who could see how a machine should work and then make it work. By the time they were grown, they had a reputation as two of the finest machinists in the Midwest, men who could build to a tolerance other shops could not hold. They were a pair, in the way that some siblings are a single unit. They worked together, drank together, and were, by most accounts, nearly impossible to deal with separately. After a run of machinist jobs in Detroit and across the river in Windsor, Ontario, working for other men's companies, they decided to work only for themselves. Horace had invented and patented a dirt-proof ball bearing, the kind of small, genuine improvement that the booming bicycle trade wanted badly. They built bicycles for a time, then sold that business and used the proceeds to open their own machine shop in Detroit in 1900. It was the beginning of their own money, money they had made rather than earned by the hour, and it gave them something most working men never get, which is independence. By the standards of Detroit society, the Dodge brothers were not gentlemen. They were red-haired and loud and physical. The stories that survive are barroom stories, of fights and broken glass and money thrown around in anger or generosity, sometimes both in the same night. The older families who ran the city did not want them. There are stories of John throwing a glass of wine in a man's face in a club, of fists in saloons, of money spent loudly, and tempers lost in public. The two of them were rarely apart, drinking in the same rooms, deciding things together, presenting a single front to a city that found them coarse. They were tolerated as suppliers and as men who were obviously going somewhere, but they were not embraced. There is something worth sitting with in that. The men who would, within 20 years, be among the richest in Detroit were the men Detroit's drawing rooms kept at arm's length. The money came first. The acceptance never fully came at all, and I think that early exclusion matters to the rest of the story, because it helped produce a family that trusted its own appetites more than it trusted any institution, and that built almost nothing meant to be shared. John was the will and the voice, the man who made the deals and won the fights. Heiress was the hands, the inventor, the one who actually understood the machines. Between them, they had everything a business needs except the one thing this story turns on, which is any instinct to build something larger and more durable than themselves. They made things, and they made money. They did not make institutions. What they were extraordinarily good at was making things. Their shop earned a reputation as the best machine operation in a city that was becoming the center of a new industry. Detroit in those years was filling up with men who had drawings of automobiles and no way to build them. The Dodge shop became the place those men came when the parts had to be right. When an engine or a transmission had to be made to a standard the inventor could not hit himself. The brothers were not dreamers. They were the people the dreamers depended on. When men with ideas for automobiles needed parts built to a standard nobody else could hit, they came to the Dodges. And in 1903, one of those men came with an idea and almost no money, and offered them a piece of paper instead of cash. That man was Henry Ford. The piece of paper would change everything. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3: 100 Shares. The deal that made the Dodge fortune was, on its face, a small one. In 1903, when the Ford Motor Company was incorporated, the brothers agreed to supply its engines and running gear. In exchange, they took 100 shares of the new company, 10% of it, in return for $10,000 worth of value, about $7,000 in materials, and a note for the remaining $3,000. $10,000, much of it not even cash, for a tenth of Ford. It is one of the great bets in the history of American business, and the brothers did not make it as a bet. They made it because Ford could not pay cash, and because they judged the man could sell cars. For a decade, they were Ford's most important supplier, building the heart of the car, while Ford built the company and the legend. John served for a time as a Ford vice president, and sat on the board, close enough to the center to see exactly how the business worked, and exactly how much of it ran on the parts his own shop made. The arrangement made them rich in a steady, accumulating way, through dividends that grew as Ford grew. And Ford grew faster than almost any company had ever grown. By some accounts, each brother collected something like $2 million in Ford dividends across those years, on top of the profits from the parts contract itself. They were being paid handsomely to supply the car, and paid again, as owners, on every car the country bought. And here is the detail that would soon matter enormously. The Dodges used that Ford money, the dividends from their 10%, to help fund the company that now competed with Ford. Henry Ford was, in effect, financing his own rival, and he knew it. Then, in 1913, they gave notice that they were ending it, and they delivered their last Ford parts the following year. The brothers could see that Ford was moving to make more of its own parts, and they had no intention of being slowly squeezed out of their own best customers' supply chain. They had watched Ford grow strong enough to start making more of its own components, and they understood what came next for a supplier in that position, which was a slow and polite strangulation. Rather than wait for it, they walked. They had also decided, after a decade of building the inside of another man's car, that they wanted to build a whole car with their own name on it. The decision to leave Ford was, in hindsight, the smartest move of their commercial lives. It gave them a company that was entirely theirs, free of any partner, answerable to no one. It also, by keeping their 10% of Ford in their pockets, set up the fight that would define them in the law books. In November of 1914, they introduced the first car to carry their own name, the Dodge Model 30, a touring car with an all-steel body and a 12-volt electrical system, built sturdier than most of what the market offered. The all-steel body was the real advance. Most cars of the day were built on wood frames that loosened and rotted. A Dodge held together. The car earned a reputation for reliability that the name carried for decades, and soldiers in the First World War who drove them came home asking for them by name. It sold the way few new products ever sell. Their production went from about 370 cars in 1914 to more than 145,000 by 1920. Company sales climbed from around $11 million in their first full year to something near $160 million. In 6 years, they had gone from a parts supplier to one of the largest car makers in the country, building under their own name, with a dealer network and a factory and a product the public trusted. They had pulled off the rarest thing in business, which is to leave a powerful patron and become more powerful without him. I want to pause on the speed of that, because it is easy to read those numbers and miss what they describe. These were two men who had started with a bicycle bearing. Within a generation, they were running an industrial enterprise that sold more in a year than most countries collected in taxes. They had done it with their hands and their judgment, and they had done it without ever being let into the rooms where the city's old money sat. But the same 10% of Ford that had funded all of it was about to put them in a courtroom against the most famous industrialist in the world, and the case they brought would still be taught in law schools a century later. Chapter 4: Dodge versus Ford. By the middle of the 1910s, Henry Ford had a problem with the Dodge brothers, and the Dodge brothers had a problem with Henry Ford. They still owned 10% of his company. They were also now his competitors, building cars that took sales away from him. And Ford had decided to stop paying the large special dividends that had been flowing to his shareholders, including the Dodges, in order to pour the company's profits back into the business, above all into the enormous new plant he was building at River Rouge. He had cut the price of his cars at the same time. The profits were there. Ford simply did not want to hand them out. Ford framed it as reinvestment, and as a kind of public service, lower prices for the public and more jobs for the city. The Dodges saw something else. The dividends Ford was cutting off were the dividends helping to fund their own car company, and they believed he was stopping them on purpose, to choke a competitor he happened to be paying. Whether Ford's motive was civic or competitive, or both, the effect was the same. The men who owned a tenth of his company were being told that the profits they were owed would be spent as he saw fit, indefinitely. So in 1916 they sued. The case dragged through the Michigan courts for 3 years. The brothers argued that a company belongs to its shareholders and must be run for their benefit, not held hostage to one man's vision of himself as a benefactor. Ford argued that he knew best, for the workers, for the customers, for the country. The case became Dodge versus Ford Motor Company, and it produced one of the most quoted decisions in American corporate law. The Michigan Supreme Court ruled, in 1919, that a company is run first for the profit of its shareholders, and that a chief executive cannot simply decide to run it as a charity at the owner's expense. The court ordered Ford to pay a special dividend, a figure the lower court had set with strange precision, at $19,275,385.96, with interest running from the original decree. The Dodge's 10% share of that came to roughly $1.9 million. The higher court let the dividend stand but reversed the part of the order that had tried to stop Ford from building his new plant. so Ford lost the money but kept his River Rouge. The idea the case is most often cited for, that a corporation is run first for the benefit of its shareholders, is still quoted and argued over in every business school and law school in the country. There is an irony in it worth naming. Two men who had been shut out of the establishment, who had built their fortune with their hands, handed American capitalism one of its most enduring arguments for putting the owners of a company ahead of everyone else who depends on it. The outsiders wrote a rule the insiders have leaned on ever since. The lawsuit, though, was the smaller event. The larger one came soon after. Ford had no intention of sharing his company with men who were now his rivals and had just dragged him through the courts. In July of 1919, determined to own the whole thing outright, he bought out every minority shareholder. He paid the Dodge brothers $25 million for their 10%, about $12.5 million each. By the standards of the day, this was an almost unimaginable sum of cash to put in private hands. Counting the dividends they had collected over the years and the buyout together, their cumulative return on that original $10,000 has been estimated at around $32 million. They had turned a parts order into one of the great private windfalls in American history, and they had done it in 16 years. Here is what strikes me about that moment. Two machinists from Niles, Michigan, men who had been kept out of Detroit's good houses, had just been paid one of the largest sums any private individuals in America had ever received, by the most famous businessman in the world, who wanted them gone. They had more money than they could spend in several lifetimes, a thriving company of their own on top of it, two great houses, yachts, every signal of arrival that money could buy in 1919. And they had, although no one in those rooms knew it yet, less than a year and a half left between the two of them. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. 11 months. In January of 1920, both brothers traveled to New York for the National Automobile Show. It was the industry's great annual gathering, the place where the year's cars and the year's reputations were on display, and the Dodge name now belonged near the top of the field. So while they were there, in the crowds and the banquets and the closed rooms, both men fell ill within days of each other. The tale of the great influenza pandemic was still moving through the country, and the show, with its crowds and its banquets, was exactly the kind of place it spread. John Dodge died first, on January 14, 1920, at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. He was 55. The cause was pneumonia, his lungs already weakened, by some accounts, by a bout of tuberculosis 2 decades earlier. In Detroit, the news landed hard. The city, that had never quite accepted the Dodges, still understood what one of them was worth, and the funeral was enormous. He was the older brother, the manager, the one who had handled the fights and the deals, gone in a single week from a man at the top of his industry to a body on a train back to Michigan. He was buried in Detroit, in an Egyptian-style mausoleum the family had built years before, at a reported cost of around $300,000, flanked by 2 stone sphinxes that still sit there today. It was the kind of monument a family builds when it expects to go on for a very long time. Horace was devastated. The brothers had been a single unit for their whole lives, and one half of it was gone. Horace had caught the influenza too, and recovered from it, but he did not recover from much else. He spent his last months at his mansion in Palm Beach, diminished and drinking, the surviving half of a partnership that had defined his whole life. He died there on December 10, 1920, 11 months, almost to the week after his brother, at the age of 52. The cause that the romantic accounts give is grief, the idea that Horace simply could not live without John. The cause on the record is cirrhosis of the liver, the kind of thing that follows a lifetime of heavy drinking. Both of those things can be true at once, and I think they probably were. A man can be drinking himself to death and still be undone by the loss of the only person who had ever fully understood him. But it is worth being precise. because the easy and often repeated version of this story has both brothers carried off together by the same pandemic, two halves of a partnership taken by one stroke of bad luck. That is not what happened. One brother's death belongs to the flu, the other belongs to the bottle and to grief, and to the 11 long months he had to sit with the silence. There is one more thing that needs to be said plainly here, because it has followed the family for a century. Years later, a book about the Dodges floated the idea that Henry Ford had the brothers poisoned with arsenic at that auto show, to be rid of them for good. There is no evidence for it. No record supports it. It is the kind of story that attaches itself to sudden deaths and large fortunes, and it should be treated as legend and nothing more. The brothers died of pneumonia and cirrhosis, 11 months apart, in the ordinary catastrophic way that people died in 1920. Between them, the brothers had owned almost the entire company, and now their widows did. Anna held Horace's share, left to her outright in his will. Matilda held John's. Of the company's 500,000 shares, the two women now controlled all but 10. What they left behind was extraordinary, and it was dangerously simple. They left a car company worth a fortune, and they left it to two women who had been married to its founders but had never been asked to run anything in their lives. The brothers had built the engine. They had not built anything to steer it. Neither widow had been raised to run a company, and neither had been invited to learn. Anna had taught piano before she married. Matilda had been a secretary in the Dodge office. They were intelligent women, but they had been kept, as the wives of that class and era were kept, at a careful distance from the machinery of the money. Now the machinery was theirs, all of it, and the men who had understood it were in the ground. The two widows now holding the company were about to make the single decision that decided everything that came after. Chapter 6. The Certified Check. In January of 1925, the two widows put the Dodge Brothers Company up for sale. Neither of them ran it, and neither of their children was prepared to. The company was enormously valuable and entirely orphaned, a great industrial machine with no member of the family willing or able to stand at the controls. So they decided to sell it, all of it, and walk away with the money. Two offers came in. General Motors, working through the bank J.P. Morgan and Company, offered about $124.5 million. Then a banking syndicate, led by the Manhattan firm of Dillon, Reed and Company, offered $146 million. The widows took the higher number. There was no sentiment in it, no preference for one buyer's vision of the company, no thought given to who would steward the name. There was a larger figure and a smaller figure, and they took the larger one. It was, on its own terms, the correct decision. Dillon. Reed was offering more than $20 million above what the largest car maker in the world was willing to pay, in cash, with no strings. By the standards of any banker advising them, refusing that offer would have been close to malpractice. The deal closed at the end of April 1925, with the delivery of a single certified check for $146 million. At the time, it was described as the largest single cash transfer for an industrial concern in the history of the United States. The company's book value was something closer to $90 million, so the widows had sold it for well above what the books said it was worth. The check itself became a small legend, a single piece of paper carrying a sum few people in 1925 could have counted in a lifetime of wages, handed across a table and then carried away. By any measure, it was a triumph of a sale. The contemporary press treated it as exactly that. The two Detroit widows who had outnegotiated General Motors and walked away with the richest check in the history of American industry. In the language of the moment, it was a victory, and the women who pulled it off were admired for it. I want to stop on that check, because it is the hinge of the whole story. Up to that moment, the Dodge fortune was a company. It was a thing that made cars and employed thousands and generated profit year after year. A machine that could go on producing wealth indefinitely, if someone competent kept their hand on it. The moment that check was signed, the fortune stopped being a company and became a pile of cash. And cash does not compound on its own. Cash does not employ anyone. Cash sits and gets spent and looks for things to be turned into. What the widows did not take was just as important as what they took. They took no stock in the restructured company. They kept no seat on any board. They retained no mechanism of control over the thing their husbands had built. They were paid in full and shown the door, by their own choice, and they accepted it gladly, because the number was so large that stewardship seemed beside the point. The buyers understood the difference perfectly. Dillon, Reed took the company they had just bought for cash and refloated it, raising about $160 million by selling stock and bonds to the public while keeping every share of the voting stock for themselves. They had bought control and then sold everything except control, and netted a profit of around $14 million for the maneuver. 3 years later, in 1928, they sold Dodge to Walter Chrysler for $170 million in stock, a deal so large for the smaller Chrysler that it was described as the minnow swallowing the whale. It made Chrysler, overnight, the third of Detroit's great automakers, a peer of Ford and General Motors, on the strength of the company 2 machinists had built and their widows had sold for cash. The Dodge name would live on for a century on the grills of Chrysler cars. The Dodge family would have nothing to do with any of it. Every party to these transactions kept control as the thing of value. Everyone except the family whose name was on the building. The widows had the cash. The bankers had the company. There was another road, and it is worth naming because the contrast is the whole argument of this story. The widows could have kept a controlling block of the company. They could have placed the proceeds inside a trust with real governance, or a foundation, or any structure built to grow and protect the money across generations. They had the wealth and the lawyers to do any of it. They chose the check instead, and cash, in the hands of people who had never been taught to govern it, was about to go looking for someone to spend it. It found him in Palm Beach. Subscribing is how stories like this keep reaching you, and it stays free. Chapter 7. How to have fun with money. Hugh Dilman was an actor. He had been born Hugh Dilman McGaughey in 1885, and he had worked on Broadway and in silent films, though without ever becoming a name anyone remembered. His one notable picture, made in 1919, cast him as a man who marries a wealthy widow. It is the kind of detail that sounds invented, and it is not. Years before he met Anna Dodge, Hugh Dilman had already played, on screen, the exact part he would go on to play in life. A few years later, he moved to Palm Beach and became a real estate agent, which in that town, in those years, meant a man who moved gracefully among the very rich and helped them spend. He was handsome and charming and comfortable in rooms full of money, and he had the particular skill, common among people who grow up without security, of making the wealthy feel that he understood exactly what their wealth was for. In 1926, he sold Anna Dodge a house. It was called Playa Riente, a villa of more than 70 rooms built by the society architect Addison Misner, and Anna bought it from an oilman named Joshua Cosden for a figure reported at $3 or $4 million. Playa Riente, the name meant Laughing Beach, was one of the great houses of Palm Beach, a Mediterranean palace of more than 70 rooms on the ocean, the kind of place that existed to be photographed and envied. Dilman was her agent on the sale, and by some accounts he took a commission of around $1 million for it. Weeks later, in May of 1926, he married her. He was roughly 14 years younger than she was. This is the marriage the thumbnail calls a con. The truth is more particular than that, and worth stating carefully. Dilman did not empty a vault and disappear. What he did was attach himself, expertly, to a woman with more money than judgment about money. At the precise moment she was looking for someone to show her how to enjoy it, he had sold her the house. He married the buyer. He then drew a substantial allowance. and was given access to her trusts, and he settled into the role of the man who taught Anna Dodge how to live like the richest woman in the world. By her own later telling, paraphrased, she credited him with exactly that. She said Hugh had taught her how to have fun with her money. It is a remarkable sentence when you sit with it. The fortune that two machinists had built with their hands, that had survived a lawsuit against Henry Ford and 2 deaths in 1 year and a record-breaking sale, had come down to a woman being taught, by a former actor, how to have fun spending it. By the standards of the family that built it, that sentence is almost an epitaph. The first generation made the money. The second generation learned to enjoy it. Nobody anywhere in the line learned to keep it, and spend it they did. Dilman guided her art buying, steering her toward the dealer Joseph Duveen and the 18th century French collection that would fill her houses. He oversaw the building and the furnishing of Rose Terrace, the chateau on the lake, choosing much of what went into it. There were the European tours, the jewels, and the 5-strand necklace of pearls that had once belonged to Catherine the Great of Russia, bought from Cartier. Even the pearls tell the story in miniature. After Anna was gone, they were broken up and scattered, some given away. The strands separated and sold off in pieces across different decades and different auction houses, until the necklace that had adorned an empress and then an American widow no longer existed as a single thing at all. There was Playa Oriente on the ocean in the winter, and Rose Terrace on the lake in the summer. 2 of the great houses of American wealth, staffed and provisioned on a scale few people could picture, run by a woman who had taught piano for a living, and a man whose chief professional credit was a film about marrying a rich widow. The allowance he drew and the trust access he was given were not loans against future earnings. He had no future earnings. They were simply the cost of having him around, and Anna paid it for 2 decades. There was a logic to all of it that ran in one direction only, which was outward, away from the principal and into objects and houses and stones that could never be turned back into a living fortune. Every dollar that went into Rose Terrace was a dollar that would, decades later, have to be subtracted at a demolition sale. The marriage lasted, on paper, more than 20 years. In practice, they separated around 1940 and divorced in 1947, after which Anna took back the Dodge name. Dilman, for his part, walked away from the marriage having lived very well on a fortune he had not built, which is its own kind of theft, even when no law is broken. But the law was not broken, and I think it matters to say so. The damage Hugh Dilman did was the damage of consumption, not of crime. He taught a fortune how to spend itself, and it proved a very apt pupil, while Anna was learning to have fun with her money. The next generation of Dodges had already begun to die. Chapter 8. The Honeymoon Boat. On a summer night in 1938, a speedboat was crossing the water off Manitoulin Island, in the Canadian waters of Lake Huron, carrying a wedding party toward a hospital on the mainland. In the boat was a 21-year-old named Daniel Dodge, the son of John Dodge and his widow Matilda, and therefore the heir to the other half of the family fortune. He had been married for 13 days. What had happened at the lodge was this. A stick of dynamite, by the most careful account lit by an employee, had gone off and injured several members of the party, Daniel among them. It was meant, by the accounts that survive, to be a celebration. The new husband and his bride and a few others at a remote lodge on the island. Instead, it became a disaster. They put the wounded in a boat to race them across the water to a doctor on the mainland. Somewhere on that crossing, in the dark and the speed and the chaos, Daniel went into the water. Whether he was thrown by a wave or fell or stood at the wrong moment is not certain. What is certain is that he drowned, and that his body was not recovered for weeks, pulled at last from the cold water of the lake while his bride, a widow of less than a month, waited on shore. The detail that I cannot get past is the coroner's. The blast injuries, the testimony indicated, were not fatal. Daniel Dodge would very likely have lived if the boat had reached the hospital. He did not die of the explosion. He died of the water between the lodge and the shore, on the way to the care that would have saved him 13 days into a marriage his family had opposed. He was 21 years old. He had been an heir to one of the great American fortunes for less than 2 weeks of married life, and he never reached the dock. They had opposed it because the bride, a 19-year-old telephone operator from Gore Bay named Annie Laureen MacDonald, was not the sort of woman the Dodges intended their heir to marry. They had called her a gold digger. There had been a prenuptial agreement allotting her $250,000. After Daniel's death, there were suspicions, never formally pursued, the inevitable whispering that follows when a poor young bride is widowed 13 days into a marriage to a rich young heir. The local researcher, who has looked hardest at the case, disputes most of the lurid details. In the end, Laureen received considerably more than the prenuptial figure, something over $1 million and a monthly stipend, money the family had fought to keep from her and then paid anyway. The drowning itself, by every serious account, was an accident, but it sits in the story as one more young Dodge dead before 30, one more fortune passing sideways to someone the family had not chosen. Daniel belonged to the John Dodge branch, the children of John and Matilda, and his death set off the kind of inheritance fight that followed nearly every death in that family. It is a pattern worth holding on to, because almost every Dodge death in both branches ended the same way, in a courtroom, with someone the family had not chosen reaching for a share. The difference, as we will see, was what one widow did with the money once the fighting stopped. But the decline was not confined to one branch. Anna's own daughter, Delphine, was failing in her own way at the same time. Delphine Dodge had been, in her youth, genuinely formidable. She was a champion powerboat racer, fast and fearless on the water, in a way that made her briefly famous. The first woman ever to win the President's Cup, handed the trophy in 1927 by the President himself. For a moment, she was the most celebrated young woman in Detroit, an heiress who could actually do something difficult and dangerous, and do it better than the men. She married 3 times. Her first husband would later marry the woman often called the richest girl in the world, a tobacco heiress, which gives some sense of the circles these people moved in. Delphine had real gifts and real nerve, but she drank, as so many of them drank, and it killed her. She died in 1943, at the age of 43. Her funeral procession had to move through the streets of a Detroit, convulsed by the race riots of that summer, the city tearing at itself in the heat, while one more Dodge was carried to the Egyptian mausoleum with the Sphinxes, the same one that had received her Uncle John more than 20 years before. She was 43. Her mother, who had buried a husband and would bury this daughter, kept living. 2 heirs of the founding generation's children, both gone before the parents who might have guided the money. But the most expensive collapse of all was not Daniel's, and it was not Delphine's. It was the one happening inside Anna's own house, with her only surviving son. If you have made it this deep into the story, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and they keep coming. Chapter 9. 5 Wives. Horace Dodge Jr. was the only son of Anna and Horace, and by the measure that mattered most in that family, the measure of whether you could hold on to money, he was a catastrophe. His mother set him up early. She gave him around $2 million to found a boat works in 1923, and he built racing boats, and he was good at racing them. He once took a trophy from the hand of a president. He was a celebrated powerboat man and a failed businessman, and his company collapsed in the Depression and never truly recovered. He married 5 times. There was Lois Knowlson, married in 1921 and divorced in 1927. There was Muriel Sisman through the 1930s. There was Martha Devine, a genuine showgirl from Earl Carroll's Vanities, who left the marriage in 1944 with a settlement of about $1 million, and who would herself be strangled to death in Florida decades later. There was Clara Tinsley, an army nurse, who was treated unusually well, left money in his will, and given a substantial settlement besides. And then, in 1953, there was Greg Sherwood. Greg Sherwood was not, strictly, the showgirl she is remembered as. She had been born Dora Mae Fjellstad in 1923, had trained as a model, dyed her hair platinum, taken a stage name, and appeared as a model and a minor actress, her showgirl reputation resting mostly on a single film role. Trouble traveled with her. An earlier husband, a ticket manager for the New York Yankees, had been charged with embezzling from the team not long after their wedding. When she married Horace Jr., the spending became something close to legend. He is said to have remarked, when he filed for divorce near the end of his life, that he could not afford the woman. He was a Dodge heir, and he could not afford his own wife. He did not live to finish the divorce. Horace Dodge Jr. died in December of 1963, at the age of 63, a man once nicknamed the only Dodge that runs on alcohol. He died owing his mother something like $10.5 million. The claims against his estate reportedly reached more than $12 million, against assets of only about $700,000. His mother had to spend over $1 million buying back, from his own estate, the very gifts she had given him while he was alive, paying a second time for things she had already paid for once, simply to keep them in the family. He had managed to be, at his death, a net cost to the fortune he was born into. Because he died before the divorce was final, and because he had cut Greg out of his will, she turned on the one source of money left. She sued his mother. Anna Dodge was by then 93 years old. Greg sued her for interfering in the marriage, and she won, taking a settlement reported at around $9 million from her elderly mother-in-law. The figures from here on come with the warning that they vary by source, and I will give them as ranges rather than pretend to a precision the record does not support. After Anna, Greg married again, a former New York police officer she had taken on as a bodyguard. He died by suicide in 1978, as their finances came apart. That same year, she filed for bankruptcy, she and the late bodyguard and her son together, with millions of dollars in debt, and very little to show for the years of Dodge money that had passed through her hands. And the following year, in 1979, she pleaded guilty to grand larceny for taking money from a trust fund belonging to her own son. The amount is usually given as about $434,000, though, as with most figures in this part of the story, the sources do not entirely agree. The trust itself is reported at somewhere between 5 and 8 million. I have gone back many times to the detail of what the son did next, because it is the one piece of grace in this part of the story. He posted his mother's bail. He stood up and asked the judge to be lenient with the woman who had just been convicted of stealing from him. She had taken his money, and he asked the court to go easy on her. She lived another 3 decades after that, and died in 2011, far from the chateaus and the yachts, in a small apartment in a town that had nothing to do with any of it. The obituary that ran described her life, accurately enough, as a journey from riches to rags. She had married into one of the richest families in America and ended with less than she had started with, which is, in its bleak way, the family pattern compressed into a single life. Through every year of it, the lawsuits and the bankruptcies and the deaths, the old woman in the chateau on the lake kept paying. She bought back what was lost. She covered what could be covered, and she kept living, far longer than anyone had any right to expect. Chapter 10. What Nothing Was Built to Hold. Anna Dodge died at Rose Terrace in June of 1970. The newspapers reported her age as 103, though the records suggest she was more likely 98 or 99. Either way, she had lived an astonishing span, long enough to outlive both of her children, long enough to see the fortune pass through 2 generations, and most of the way out the other side. She had been a piano teacher in Detroit when the century began. She died one of the last great figures of an age that had already ended. Then came the will, and the will is the heart of this story. She left a fortune still in excess of $100 million. She left it to 4 of her 7 grandchildren, the larger part to the children of her ruinous son. She left it to people. She did not leave it to anything. There was no foundation. There was no trust designed to outlast the family. There was no museum, no hospital, no university with the Dodge name carved over a door. Her largest single civic gift was around $2 million to the city of Detroit to build a fountain. It stands in Hart Plaza today, designed by the sculptor Isamu Noguchi, a fine and abstract thing that bears the family name. It is, finally, the closest the Horace Dodge fortune came to building a monument to itself, and it pours water. 6 years after she died, the salvage crews came for Rose Terrace. It would be easy to tell this as a story about predators. The actor who married the widow, the platinum-haired wife who bled the son, and then his grandson, the bodyguard, the string of settlements. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, or at least it would miss the point. The predators were real, but predators gather wherever there is unguarded money, the way weather gathers. They are not the reason the fortune disappeared. They are a symptom of the reason. What strikes me, after walking through all of it, is that the Dodge fortune did not fail for lack of money. It failed for lack of walls. The Fords, facing the same kind of wealth and the same kind of mortality, built walls. They created the Ford Foundation and split their company into 2 kinds of stock: non-voting shares that went to the foundation and voting shares the family kept, so that the family held control while the bulk of the fortune sat locked inside an institution designed to outlive every individual Ford. When the company finally sold shares to the public, the foundation was made liquid and the family kept its grip through the votes. Sebastian Kresge did a version of the same thing with his foundation in 1924, endowing it with stock that grew as his stores grew. Those families are still here, in the institutions that carry their names. The Ford Foundation alone holding an endowment in the billions. They built things to hold the money, and the things held. What survived of the Dodges is telling. The yacht Horace built, named for his daughter Delphine and launched in 1921, months after his death, was the largest private yacht ever made in America. It caught fire and sank, was raised, was restored, served as a warship in the Second World War, was bought back by Anna afterward, and survives today, restored again, sailing somewhere in Europe under other ownership, the most durable object the fortune ever produced. A fountain pours in Detroit, and there is one real institution, a university near Rochester, Michigan called Oakland, founded on the land and the money of Matilda, the other widow, John's wife, who had remarried a careful man and chosen to give a great estate and $2 million to build something that would teach people after she was gone. That institution exists because the one Dodge widow who built walls built them on purpose. What did not survive was everything that belonged to Horace's line. The company's stake, sold for cash. The houses, demolished. The fortune, dispersed and consumed. Go back, one last time, to that cold day in 1976, and the salvage crew on the shore of Lake St. Clair. The 75-room chateau coming apart. The men pulling the lead from the roof and stacking the cut stone in the yard. The most expensive house ever built in Detroit, sold off piece by piece, down to the driveway and the trees. It is the same scene the story opened on. On the first pass, it was a tragedy of taste, a beautiful house no one could afford to keep. The demolition is not the accident at the end of the story. It is the story, made visible. It is what a fortune looks like when it has been turned entirely into things. And the things have outlived the will to keep them, and there was never anything underneath them built to hold them up. The fountain still runs in Detroit. The yacht still sails somewhere in Europe. There is a street of comfortable newer houses where the chateau used to stand, and a university that carries a different branch's gift. There is no foundation with the Dodge name on it, and there never was. This is what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.